Hi there, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to a grand battlefield or a bustling market, but to a place far more intimate and, perhaps, just as perilous, the medieval wedding. Imagine yourself in a drafty stone hall, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. You can almost hear the nervous murmurs, the rustle of rough-spun cloth, and the faint, unsettling squeal of a pig destined for the spit. This isn't the fairy tale wedding you've seen in movies, with doves and endless white lace. Oh no, you probably won't survive this kind of wedding without at least a mild case of the bubonic plague, or, at the very least, an incredibly uncomfortable sense of social obligation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to post your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fun to see where you're all drifting off to sleep. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported, a silent observer in a world where happily ever after was less about romance and more about real estate. The very air feels different, heavier, with the weight of tradition and pragmatism. You might catch a whiff of unwashed wool or the sweet, cloying smell of fermenting mead. The sounds are raw, the clatter of wooden trenchers, the distant bleating of a goat, the low, guttural murmur of conversations about land deeds and livestock. You're witnessing the subtle anxieties of a young woman, perhaps no older than your own teenager, being led towards a future she didn't choose, or the stoic resolve of a father securing his family's lineage through a well-placed alliance. This isn't just about a couple getting hitched. It's about communities intertwining, resources merging, and bloodlines continuing. Think of it as the ultimate medieval merger and acquisition, but with significantly more awkward dancing. The concept of love as a prerequisite for marriage, which we hold so dear today, was largely a fanciful notion, a poetic ideal for troubadours, not for the practicalities of daily life. For the vast majority, marriage was an economic and social arrangement, a contract sealed by families for mutual benefit. It was the bedrock of medieval society, establishing property rights, securing inheritances, and solidifying social standing. A marriage could elevate a family, forge a powerful alliance, or simply ensure the next harvest had enough hands to bring it in. You see, your future wasn't really your own. It was a carefully constructed puzzle piece in a much larger, intergenerational strategy, and you thought picking out wedding favors was stressful. Interestingly, while affection wasn't the primary driver, instances of genuine devotion certainly weren't unheard of. There's a quirky tidbit about some regional customs where a couple might exchange love tokens, even if their union was primarily strategic, a small gesture of personal sentiment amidst the grander machinations. But generally, the pragmatic elements trumped personal desires. Historians still argue whether such tokens represented a genuine emotional bond, or were simply a performative nod to the romantic ideals gaining traction in courtly literature. Either way, the main event was the binding of assets, not hearts. You might even find yourself wondering if any of those young brides and grooms ever secretly wished for a dragon to swoop in and whisk them away, if only to escape the endless discussions of livestock dowries. It was a time when your worth was often measured in sheep and acres, not in the sparkle in your beloved's eyes. It's enough to make you appreciate modern dating apps, isn't it? Almost. Consider the ripple effect of a single marriage contract. A lord might secure peace with a neighboring rival by marrying off his daughter, ending years of costly skirmishes. A merchant family might elevate their social standing by uniting with a landowning noble, even if the noble was, shall we say, less than charming. For peasants, a marriage might mean gaining access to more arable land, sharing labor during harvest, or simply ensuring someone was there to care for you in your twilight years. The stakes were incredibly high, much higher than choosing the right caterer. You couldn't just swipe left if things weren't working out. You were in it for the long haul, often for the benefit of generations yet unborn. The emotional landscape of these unions was incredibly complex, a tapestry woven with duty, hope, resignation, and occasionally a surprising thread of genuine connection. The societal pressure to marry was immense. Unmarried adults, particularly women, faced significant social stigma and economic hardship. Life was harsh, and a partner meant shared burdens, mutual protection, and the continuation of your family line, which was a deeply ingrained societal imperative. From a very young age, children were aware of their potential roles in these marital chess games. It wasn't about finding the one in a soulmate sense. It was about finding the one that best served your family's interests. And while we might chuckle at the idea now, the practicalities were paramount. Imagine trying to run a farm, raise children, and defend your meager possessions all on your own in a world where disease, famine, and violence were constant threats. A spouse was, quite literally, a partner in survival. Sometimes, you'd even see what looked like genuine affection develop after the marriage. A slow burn of companionship and shared experience. It wasn't the dramatic, cinematic romance we crave, but a quieter, more enduring kind of bond forged through shared hardships and triumphs. Historians still debate the true prevalence of these affectionate unions. Was it common enough to be a significant factor, or merely an exception to the rule? Regardless, the groundwork was always practical. You might have found yourself nodding along during a particularly dry dowry negotiation, internally calculating how many chickens that land grant could support. It truly puts a new spin on for richer, for poorer, doesn't it? The very foundation of your existence, your social standing, your future security, and even your children's prospects, all hinged on these meticulously arranged unions. It's a stark reminder that what we consider normal in relationships is a relatively modern invention. So, you've just grasped the rather unromantic reality of medieval marriage as a strategic alliance. Now, let's talk about the first crucial step in this elaborate dance, the betrothal. This wasn't some casual going steady announcement. It was a legally binding contract, a promise to marry, often made years before the actual wedding ceremony. Imagine signing a major business deal, but instead of merging companies, you're merging entire family legacies. You'd find yourself sitting in a chilly chamber, perhaps a lord's solar or a merchant's counting house, watching as parchments were unrolled and quill pens scratched out terms that would dictate the next several decades of your life. The air would be thick with anticipation, not of love, but of profit and power. The betrothal, or sponsor layer, typically involved an agreement between the families of the prospective bride and groom. Sometimes, the future spouses might be present, but often, especially if they were very young, their parents or guardians acted entirely on their behalf. This was the moment when the crucial details were hammered out. The dowry the bride's family would provide. The dower the groom would settle upon his future wife. And any other specific clauses related to inheritance, property rights, and even potential heirs. It was less about whether he put a ring on it and more about whether he put a significant chunk of land and gold on it. The engagement ring, if one was given, was a mere trifle compared to the serious financial negotiations occurring. You might even find yourself stifling a yawn as the legalese droned on, wishing you were out in the stable, playing with the puppies, instead of listening to the intricate details of a feudal tax arrangement that indirectly involved your future. A fascinating, somewhat quirky aspect of betrothals was their legal weight. In some regions, a betrothal was considered almost as binding as marriage itself. If either party backed out without a very good reason, like a significant breach of contract, or an unrevealed impediment like consanguinity, severe financial penalties, or even social ostracization could follow. It was a serious commitment, reflecting the period's emphasis on oaths and promises. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal but illustrative, of a young noble who tried to renege on a betrothal because he'd taken a fancy to another lady, only to find himself hauled before an ecclesiastical court and compelled to honor the original agreement. Talk about awkward family dinners for the next 40 years. The church, ever keen to exert its influence, played an increasingly important role in formalizing these agreements. While initially more of a secular contract, by the later Middle Ages, the church began to insist on public betrothals and even blessings, emphasizing the sacred nature of the promise. This meant that the contract wasn't just witnessed by family and scribes, but increasingly by priests and community members. This added an extra layer of moral and spiritual pressure to uphold the agreement. Historians still argue about the exact point at which the church's involvement transformed betrothal from a purely contractual obligation into a quasi-religious rite. Was it a gradual process of integration, or did specific papal decrees dramatically shift the landscape? You, however, are probably just thinking about how many sheep that dowry represents. The purpose was clear: stability. In a world where alliances shifted like the wind and resources were scarce, a formal betrothal provided a degree of certainty. It allowed families to plan for the future, to merge estates, or to secure a strategic foothold in a new region. For the individuals involved, it meant their future was, for better or worse, largely decided. You wouldn't wake up one morning to find your intended had suddenly decided to join a monastery, though that certainly did happen sometimes, causing considerable familial headaches. No, this was a done deal, practically speaking. It might not have been what you wanted, but it was what your family needed. And in the medieval world, family needs almost always trumped individual desires. It really puts cold feet in a whole new perspective, doesn't it? Because, in this era, cold feet could lead to very warm legal trouble. So, while you might dream of a romantic proposal on bended knee, complete with soaring violins and a sunset, your medieval counterpart was likely more concerned with whether the ink on the parchment would smudge, and if the promised oxen were sturdy enough. The betrothal was the moment the gears of fate truly began to turn, locking two lives onto a shared, often predetermined path, all for the greater good of family, land, and lineage. No grand gestures, no declarations of undying affection, just the sober reality of two families striking a deal, witnessed and legally binding, laying the groundwork for a future that was anything but uncertain. It was the ultimate trust, the process moment, even if the process involved more ledgers than longing looks. With the betrothal firmly established, you now move to the very bedrock of these medieval marital alliances, the dowry and dower. Forget the sentimental notion of something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue for a moment. In the medieval world, marriage was less about merging hearts and more about merging assets. and these two terms were the financial engine of almost every union. You're standing, perhaps, beside a robust chest, not unlike a pirate's treasure chest, only instead of doubloons, it might contain bolts of fine cloth, a strong box of silver pennies, or even deeds to parcels of land. The air hums with a more mercantile energy than even the betrothal negotiations. This is where fortunes could be made or lost. Let's start with the dowry. This was the property, goods, or money that the bride's family transferred to the groom or his family upon marriage. Think of it as a contribution to the new household, designed to support the wife and, eventually, her children. It was, in essence, her share of her family's wealth, handed over upon her marriage rather than as an inheritance after her parents' deaths. The size and nature of a dowry could vary wildly. For a peasant family, it might be a few chickens, a cow, some household linens, and a sturdy cooking pot, items essential for setting up a new, modest home. For a wealthy merchant's daughter, it could be a significant sum of cash, valuable trade goods, or even property in a bustling town. And for a noblewoman, a dowry might include entire estates, castles, or vast tracts of land, complete with their tenants and revenues. Imagine trying to explain that to your modern-day wedding planner. Yes, darling, for the dowry, we're bringing 3 villagers and a fully stocked piggery. The dowry served multiple purposes. Firstly, it provided for the bride, offering her some financial security within her new family. Secondly, it acted as a sort of advance inheritance, ensuring daughters received a portion of the family wealth when they married, rather than waiting for their parents to pass. This was particularly important as sons typically inherited the bulk of the family's immovable property, like land. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, a substantial dowry could enhance a bride's desirability and elevate her social standing. A family with many daughters and a limited ability to provide large dowries faced considerable challenges in marrying them off well. Conversely, a magnificent dowry could enable a family of lesser social standing to marry into a more prestigious lineage, effectively buying their way up the social ladder. Historians still argue about whether the dowry was primarily a form of female inheritance or a payment for a husband, but its practical impact on medieval life is undeniable. Now, let's pivot to the dower, not dowry. Mind you, easy to mix up, isn't it? The dower was the portion of the husband's property that was settled on his wife at the time of marriage, specifically for her maintenance should she become a widow. This was incredibly important, providing a vital safety net for women in an age where their legal and economic rights were often limited. If her husband died, the dower ensured she wouldn't be left destitute. It usually consisted of a life interest in a specific portion of his lands or other assets, meaning she could use the income from them for her lifetime, but she couldn't sell them or pass them on to her own heirs. Upon her death, the dower lands would revert to her husband's family or his rightful heir. The dower was a powerful legal instrument. It was typically specified in the marriage contract and was legally protected even from the husband's debts. This meant a widow, even if her husband had mismanaged his affairs, often had guaranteed income. It was, in effect, medieval pension planning, but with more cows and less paperwork. A common dower amount was 1/3 of the husband's lands, a tradition that echoed Roman and Germanic legal practices. You might imagine a scene where, perhaps years after the wedding, a newly widowed countess, dressed in her somber weeds, sternly reminds her late husband's brother that those specific fields and that manor house are hers for the duration of her natural life, "Thank you very much." She wouldn't be doing it out of spite, but out of necessity and legal right. There's a quirky tidbit about dower, which was a symbolic dower declared at the church door immediately after the wedding ceremony. This public declaration served to make the dower known to all, reinforcing its legal standing and discouraging any future disputes. It was a bit like shouting your financial plan from the rooftops, just to make sure everyone got the memo. You can almost hear the murmurs of approval from the local gossips, noting the generosity or parsimony of the groom. The intricate dance between dowry and dower highlights just how deeply financial considerations permeated medieval marriages. Love might be a modern aspiration, but land, livestock, and security were the true currency of commitment. Without these foundational economic arrangements, the entire social fabric of the time would unravel. Historians still grapple with whether the dower, in practice, always provided adequate security for widows, given the often precarious nature of land tenure and the constant threats of war and disease. But for you, watching these exchanges, it's clear medieval weddings were truly the original power suits, tailored not from cloth, but from property and promises. Having navigated the complex financial currents of dowry and dower, you now come face to face with perhaps the most pivotal and least romantic aspect of medieval marriage: the choosing of a spouse. Forget dating apps, speed dating, or even meeting someone cute at a local festival. In this era, the decision of who you would marry was almost never yours. Instead, it was a strategic hand played by your family, with consequences far beyond your personal happiness. You might feel a pang of sympathy for the young man or woman whose fate is being decided over a goblet of ale and a map. Their personal desires utterly secondary to the grander scheme. For noble families, marriage was a potent tool for political maneuvering and the accumulation of power. A daughter could be married off to seal a peace treaty, forging an alliance with a former enemy and preventing costly future wars. A son might be wed to an heiress, instantly expanding the family's landholdings and increasing their wealth. Imagine two powerful lords, their faces grimly serious, poring over genealogies and maps, discussing their children as if they were pawns on a chessboard. "My daughter, Lady Eleanor, is a fine match for your eldest, Sir Reginald. She brings with her the fertile lands of Greymoor and a detachment of 20 loyal knights." The children, meanwhile, might not have even met. Or if they had, it was likely at a formal gathering where they were instructed to behave impeccably, certainly not to flirt. Peasant families, while operating on a much smaller scale, also saw marriage as a practical arrangement. A marriage could mean gaining an extra pair of hands for the farm, sharing livestock, or combining small, scattered land plots into a more manageable holding. If you were a peasant, your parents might eye the sturdy son of a neighboring family, not for his charming smile, but for his strong back and knowledge of crop rotation. A daughter might be sought for her skill at weaving or her ability to manage a household efficiently. Love was a luxury, survival was a necessity. You might overhear whispers of families trying to keep their children within the village, to maintain established social networks and mutual support systems, avoiding outsiders who might disrupt the familiar rhythm of life. The concept of free choice in marriage was almost non-existent, particularly for those higher up the social ladder. While the church increasingly emphasized the importance of consent, that a marriage was only valid if both parties willingly consented to it, this consent was often given under immense familial pressure. Could a young noblewoman truly refuse a marriage that meant peace for her kingdom? Could a peasant girl defy her parents when her marriage meant the difference between starvation and a slightly less arduous life for her family? It's a tricky line. Historians still argue about the true extent of individual agency in medieval marriages. Was consent genuinely given, even under duress? Or was it often a mere formality? You're left to ponder the silent battles fought within these arranged unions. The internal struggles against a preordained fate. Sometimes a family might even betroth children when they were infants, perhaps even before they could walk or talk. This ensured the alliance was set in stone early, preventing other families from swooping in. The children would then grow up knowing their destiny, their future spouse a predetermined fact of their existence. Imagine knowing your entire life, from the cradle, precisely who you would marry. It takes away the agony of choice, perhaps, but it also strips away the joy of discovery. There's a quirky anecdote about a noble lord who, having arranged his infant daughter's marriage, then proceeded to swap her with his niece for purely strategic reasons when the niece proved to be of more beneficial lineage. His daughter was none the wiser until much later in life, a rather extreme example of parental proxy decision-making. The decision-making process was usually a slow, deliberate one, involving extensive negotiations between the heads of families. Genealogies would be scrutinized for any hint of consanguinity, blood relation, which was a barrier to marriage in the eyes of the church. Potential inheritances would be calculated, and social standings meticulously weighed. It was less like a romantic courtship and more like an audit. The well-being of the entire lineage, and sometimes the entire feudal domain, rested on making the right match. You might find yourself observing these solemn proceedings, feeling a strange mix of relief that such burdens aren't yours, and a profound sense of the human cost of such rigid societal structures. The chosen spouse was not just a partner, they were an investment, a political statement, and a crucial link in the chain of continuity. So, your family has meticulously chosen your future spouse, weighing every asset and alliance. Now, let's delve into an aspect of medieval marriage that often raises modern eyebrows: the age of consent. When you picture a wedding, you probably imagine adults, perhaps in their 20s or 30s, ready to embark on a life together. But in the medieval era, the idea of an adult bride or groom was, shall we say, a bit more flexible. You might feel a chill run down your spine as you realize just how young some of these individuals were. Their childhoods cut short by the demands of lineage and property. The mainstream historical fact here is that the official canonical church age of consent for marriage was surprisingly young: 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Yes, you heard that right. 12 and 14. This wasn't some fringe custom. It was the widely accepted legal standard across much of medieval Europe. The church, while emphasizing the importance of consent, clearly defined it at an age that we would today consider childhood. This meant that, theoretically, a 12-year-old girl could agree to a marriage, and that agreement would be considered legally binding, while actual marriage ceremonies often took place a few years later. Perhaps when the couple was in their late teens, the betrothal could happen much, much earlier, formalizing the union from infancy in some cases. Imagine being a preteen, still, figuring out how to tie your shoes properly, and knowing your entire adult life partner was already decided. It's enough to make you grateful for the freedom to just pick your own socks in the morning. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, while 12 and 14 were the canonical ages, marriages and especially betrothals could sometimes be arranged even earlier. There are records of infants being betrothed. though these were more like future contracts that required a later official consent when the children reached the canonical age. If a marriage occurred before the canonical age, it was considered imperfect and could be annulled unless the couple, upon reaching the legal age, explicitly chose to ratify or reconsent to the union. This creates an interesting legal loophole, a sort of medieval undo button, but only if you manage to press it at the right time. You can almost picture a bewildered 13-year-old being asked if they'd like to confirm their marriage, having likely forgotten they were even betrothed to begin with. The reasons for such early marriage ages were deeply rooted in the realities of medieval life. Firstly, life expectancy was considerably shorter. If you wanted to ensure heirs and the continuation of your family line, you needed to start young. Delaying marriage meant risking death by disease, famine, or warfare before you could produce children. Secondly, particularly for noble families, early betrothals solidified political alliances for longer periods and prevented potential rivals from snatching up desirable heiresses or heirs. Marrying off a child at a young age ensured that the family's strategic goals were met quickly and decisively. And thirdly, for agricultural communities, an extra pair of hands was always welcome on the farm, and marrying off children meant forming new household units that could contribute to the overall labor force. It was less about nurturing young love and more about pragmatic population management. Historians still argue whether the concept of childhood as we understand it even existed in the medieval period in the same way. Were these young brides and grooms truly seen as children, or were they considered small adults, ready to take on adult responsibilities as soon as they were physically able? The evidence is mixed, with some scholars pointing to the playful aspects of medieval childhood, while others emphasize the early integration of children into adult work and social roles. You might imagine a tiny bride, no taller than your knee, trying to manage a household, or a small groom attempting to command respect from his tenants. It was a world that demanded maturity long before our modern society would deem it appropriate. The practical implications of marrying so young were profound. For girls, it often meant an abrupt transition from girlhood to the burdens of household management and childbearing. Many young women would become mothers shortly after their 12th or 13th birthday, putting immense strain on their bodies in an era with limited medical knowledge. For boys, it meant taking on the responsibilities of a household head, managing land, and potentially even military duties at an age when today they'd be playing video games. There were no gap years, no extended periods of self-discovery. Your future was set, and you were expected to step into it, ready or not. It makes you wonder how many medieval young adult novels would have simply ended with, "And then she got married at 13 and had 6 children, the end." A real page-turner, I'm sure. So, you've witnessed the solemn betrothal, understood the weight of dowry and dower, and perhaps winced at the incredibly young ages at which these unions were forged. Now, let's turn our attention to an essential and highly public step that ensured the entire community knew about the impending nuptials, the banns of marriage. This wasn't just a quaint tradition. It was a crucial safeguard designed to prevent unlawful marriages and ensure transparency in a world where records were scarce and communities were tight-knit. You might imagine yourself standing amidst a congregation, perhaps a little bored, as the local priest reads out the names, his voice echoing in the stone church. The mainstream historical fact is that the posting or proclamation of bans of marriage became a widespread and vital practice across medieval Europe, enforced by canon law. Essentially, A public announcement of the intention to marry was made in the parish church of both the bride and groom, for 3 consecutive Sundays or holy days during the main service. This was usually done during Mass, when the largest number of people would be present. The priest would announce the names of the prospective couple and invite anyone who knew of a legal impediment to the marriage to come forward. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a very public social media announcement. But instead of likes, you're hoping for no objections. What constituted a legal impediment? Oh, the list was rather extensive and could be quite complicated. It primarily revolved around consanguinity being too closely related by blood, which was a major no-no in the eyes of the Church. Affinity being too closely related by marriage. For example, marrying your deceased spouse's sibling, or a pre-existing contract like another marriage or a solemn vow of chastity. If, for instance, a distant cousin who you hadn't seen since you were knee-high to a grasshopper popped up during the band's reading to reveal a shared great-great-grandmother, your wedding plans could grind to a halt. Historians still argue about how effective the bans truly were in catching all impediments, especially in large or transient populations, but they certainly provided a significant deterrent. There's a quirky tidbit about how people actually made their objections known. It wasn't always a polite whisper to the priest. Sometimes, someone with knowledge of an impediment might publicly call out during the service, causing quite a stir. Imagine the gasps and murmurs rippling through the congregation as someone declares, "But Father, he's already secretly married to my sister's cousin 3 villages over." It would have been the ultimate church drama, far more captivating than the sermon, and a definite highlight for the local gossip mill. This public challenge, however, wasn't taken lightly. You had to have a legitimate reason and be prepared to prove it, as false accusations could have serious consequences. The practice of bans served several crucial purposes beyond just checking for impediments. Firstly, it formalized the intention to marry, making it a public commitment. No secret. Weddings in the dead of night for most people. This was a community affair. Secondly, it acted as a form of social control and community policing. Everyone in the village knew who was marrying whom, and could exert subtle or overt pressure to ensure the proper customs were followed. And thirdly, it reinforced the Church's authority over marriage. By making these announcements a mandatory part of the spiritual service, the Church asserted its role as the ultimate arbiter of lawful unions, slowly but surely shifting marriage from a purely secular contract to a sacrament. You might be wondering, what happened if an impediment was declared? Well, the marriage would be suspended, and an investigation would begin, usually conducted by the ecclesiastical courts. This could be a lengthy and often expensive process, involving witnesses, sworn testimonies, and delving into family histories. Many a hopeful couple found their dreams dashed by the revelation of a too close blood tie, forcing them to seek a papal dispensation, a special permission from the Pope. Often costly and difficult to obtain, or abandon the union altogether. So, that nervous twitch you feel while waiting for your name to be read during a school assembly, multiply that by about 1,000, add the weight of your family's honor, and you're getting close to the medieval ban's experience. It was a moment of public scrutiny, a final test of worthiness before the ultimate commitment. You've heard the bans, so the whole village knows you're getting hitched. Now, before the actual ceremony, comes a layer of complexity that might surprise you. Prenuptial agreements. You probably think of these as a very modern invention, something for wealthy celebrities or those with multiple divorces under their belt. But in the medieval world, these contractual arrangements were quite common, particularly among the propertied classes, and they were far from casual. You're now witnessing the meticulous nature of medieval legal minds, ensuring every last sheep and every last acre is accounted for. The mainstream historical fact is that detailed written contracts, specifying the financial arrangements of a marriage, were prevalent throughout the Middle Ages, especially for noble and wealthy merchant families. These were essentially marriage settlements, meticulously laying out the dowry from the bride's side and the dower or jointure from the groom's side. Remember that dower we talked about, the provision for the wife if she became a widow. These prenuptial agreements detailed precisely which lands, revenues, or goods would constitute that dower. They also often stipulated what would happen to the dowry in various scenarios, such as if the bride died without heirs, or if the marriage was annulled. It was a rigorous exercise in risk management, medieval style. These agreements went beyond just the basic dowry and dower. They could specify the number of attendants the bride would bring to her new household, the cost of her wardrobe, or even the type of feasts that would be held. For grand aristocratic unions, these documents could be incredibly lengthy and complex, negotiated over months, sometimes even years. Imagine a legal team, albeit in monks' robes, poring over scrolls and waxing lyrical about the yield of a specific pasture. Every possible contingency was considered, from the distribution of personal property to the upbringing of future children. You might feel a dull ache in your head just imagining the sheer volume of bureaucratic detail involved, far more intricate than picking out dinnerware patterns. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of these prenuptial contracts even contained clauses about the appearance of the prospective spouse. While certainly not common, there are rare instances where a contract might include a provision that if the intended spouse turned out to have a disfiguring illness or a severe physical deformity not disclosed prior to the agreement, the contract could be voided. It's a stark, if somewhat chilling, reminder that medieval marriage was indeed a transaction where the goods had to meet a certain standard. Historians still argue about how frequently such clauses were truly invoked, or if they merely served as a deterrent against deception during negotiations. Was it a genuine concern for physical attributes, or simply another layer of legal protection against bad faith? It certainly paints a vivid, if unflattering, picture of a pragmatic world. These prenuptials were vital for the security of both families. For the bride's family, it ensured their daughter would be provided for, regardless of her husband's fortunes or eventual demise. For the groom's family, it clarified the assets being brought into the marriage and protected their own inheritance by specifying which properties were destined to support the wife and which would remain strictly within the husband's lineage. It minimized disputes over property, which were a constant threat in a society where land was power. Without these detailed agreements, property ownership could become incredibly muddled, leading to costly legal battles and even violent feuds between families. You'd find the language in these documents to be formal and precise, filled with legal Latin phrases and archaic terms for property and inheritance. Scribes, often monastic, would meticulously hand-copy these agreements onto durable parchment, sealed with the impressive wax seals of the negotiating parties. These documents were the ultimate expression of trust and foresight, a testament to the fact that medieval people, despite living in a world we perceive as chaotic, were incredibly methodical when it came to their long-term financial and familial well-being. So, the next time you hear about a celebrity prenup, Remember that it's a tradition with roots stretching back over 1,000 years, proving that when it comes to money and marriage, some things truly never change. You might even find yourself silently applauding their foresight, even if your own wedding plans involve nothing more complicated than deciding between chicken or fish. With the complex financial and legal intricacies of the betrothal and prenuptial agreements firmly behind you, it's time to consider what the medieval bride and groom actually wore. If your mind immediately conjures images of flowing white gowns and perfectly tailored suits, you're in for a delightful medieval reality check. Wedding attire then was less about grand display and more about symbolism, not sparkle. You might find yourself peering at the rough textures and muted colors, a stark contrast to the dazzling silks and satins you're accustomed to seeing in modern bridal magazines. The mainstream historical fact is that the white wedding dress, as we know it today, is a relatively recent invention, largely popularized by Queen Victoria's choice for her marriage in 1840. In the medieval period, there was no specific wedding dress, color, or style. Instead, brides and grooms typically wore their best clothes, which meant garments made from the finest fabrics they could afford, often in rich, vibrant colors that denoted wealth and status. Think deep reds, blues, or greens, dyed with expensive pigments. A noble bride might wear a gown of silk or fine wool, perhaps embroidered with gold thread, while a peasant bride would don her newest and sturdiest tunic and kirtle, likely made of coarser wool or linen. The emphasis was on demonstrating the family's standing and prosperity, not adhering to a specific bridal aesthetic. For noble women, their best might include layers of tunics, a surcoat, an outer gown, and perhaps a mantle, all adorned with furs or jewels if their family was truly wealthy. Men, too, would wear their finest tunics, hose, and possibly a fur-lined cloak or a finely woven outer garment. The idea was to look dignified, prosperous, and appropriately dressed for a formal occasion. It was less about a single show-stopping garment and more about the overall impression of wealth and propriety. You'd likely see more practical considerations at play than fashion trends, like the need for warmth in an unheated hall, or durability for a garment that might serve as Sunday best for years to come. Here's a quirky tidbit. While white wasn't the norm, blue was a particularly favored color for brides across various social strata. Why blue? Because blue symbolized purity, fidelity, and the Virgin Mary. So, a bride wearing blue was subtly invoking spiritual blessings and broadcasting her virtuous intentions. It was a popular choice, though certainly not mandatory. You might even imagine a peasant girl proudly donning a new blue apron or a blue ribbon in her hair, her own small nod to tradition and hope for a faithful marriage. This subtle symbolism often went unnoticed by us modern folk, obsessed with the meaning of every modern choice. But it was deeply ingrained in the medieval mindset. Beyond color, specific accessories often carried significant symbolic weight. A wedding veil, though not necessarily white, was common and symbolized modesty and purity. For noble women, elaborate headwear, like a circlet or a jeweled headdress, could signify her status. The groom might wear a special belt or a cap. Flowers and herbs, particularly those associated with fertility and good fortune like rosemary or myrtle, were often incorporated into the attire or carried by the couple and their attendants. These weren't merely decorative. They were believed to offer protection against evil spirits or bring blessings to the union. You might notice a small pouch of fragrant herbs tucked into a bride's sleeve, or a sprig of rosemary pinned to a groom's tunic. Tiny talismans against the uncertainties of life. Historians still argue about the true extent to which individuals had input into their wedding attire, especially for arranged marriages. Was it entirely dictated by family, tradition, and financial means, or did personal preferences sometimes manage to creep into the choices, even for minor details, while the ultimate decisions were likely made by the family heads? One can imagine a young noblewoman perhaps subtly hinting at a preference for a certain shade of green, or a peasant groom expressing a desire for a new pair of boots over a slightly finer tunic. Regardless, the overarching goal was to present the family in the best possible light, demonstrating their status and seriousness of intent through the quality and symbolism of the clothing. So, as you observe the rich fabrics and practical designs, remember that every thread, every color, and every herb was telling a story, far older and far more practical than our modern tales of sartorial splendor. You've seen the practical attire, more an expression of status than fashion. Now, let's consider the invisible, yet immensely powerful, force that increasingly shaped these medieval unions. The Church's role. In the early Middle Ages, marriage was largely a secular, contractual affair, often arranged and witnessed within families. But as the centuries progressed, the Church steadily exerted its influence, transforming marriage from a mere civil agreement into a sacred sacrament, a holy bond blessed by God. You're now standing in a dimly lit church, the scent of incense lingering, feeling the weight of divine authority descend upon the proceedings. The mainstream historical fact is that by the 12th century, the Church had firmly established marriage as one of the 7 sacraments. This meant that for a marriage to be considered valid and legitimate, it required more than just the consent of the families and the exchange of property. It also needed to be performed or at least blessed by a priest. This was a monumental shift. No longer just a social or economic contract, marriage became an unbreakable spiritual bond, divinely ordained and, theoretically, indissoluble. This transformation gave the Church immense power over people's marital lives. From dictating acceptable partners, remember the rules on consanguinity, to enforcing marital fidelity. Before this shift, a couple could technically marry themselves through mutual consent and cohabitation, a sort of common law marriage. While this remained somewhat recognized, the Church increasingly pushed for formal ceremonies within consecrated ground, presided over by a cleric. This move wasn't just about ritual, it was about control. By controlling the rites of marriage, the Church gained authority over legitimacy of heirs, inheritance, and moral conduct. You might observe the subtle shift in power dynamics. As family heads, once sole arbiters, now defer to the authority of the local priest or bishop, their secular agreements needing the stamp of divine approval. Here's a quirky tidbit to further assert its authority. The Church eventually mandated that marriages should take place at the church door or within the church porch, rather than within the private homes of the families. This made the ceremony a public event, witnessed by the community, and ensured a priest was present to bless the union. It was a visible demonstration of the Church's claim over matrimony. Imagine a nervous young couple standing on the cold stone steps, perhaps a few curious villagers peering over their shoulders, as the priest recites the Latin blessings. This wasn't just about convenience. It was a carefully orchestrated display of spiritual power, ensuring that everyone knew who was truly in charge of defining what a marriage was. The Church also rigorously enforced rules regarding impediments to marriage, like degrees of kinship. Marrying a distant cousin, something perfectly acceptable in some cultures, was strictly forbidden without a special dispensation from the Pope, which was often costly and difficult to obtain. These rules, while sometimes seemingly arbitrary, served to prevent powerful families from consolidating too much wealth and influence through endless intermarriage. They also, arguably, promoted wider social connections. Historians still argue whether the Church's increasingly strict rules on consanguinity were primarily driven by genuine theological concerns for genetic health, or more by a desire to extend its control over noble lineages and their land holdings. For you, however, the practical effect is clear. Navigating the intricate web of family trees became a matter of eternal salvation. Not just social etiquette, the Church's role extended beyond the wedding day itself. It sought to regulate marital life, promoting fidelity and condemning bigamy or adultery. Ecclesiastical courts heard cases related to marriage disputes, annulments, and separations, providing a legal framework that intertwined with secular law. The ideal of marriage as a permanent, sacred bond till death do us part largely emerged from the Church's teachings, shaping societal expectations for centuries to come. So, while your modern mind might focus on the vows exchanged, remember that the very concept of those vows, and the hallowed ground upon which they were spoken, was increasingly dictated by a powerful spiritual institution. The faint sound of Gregorian chant seems to underscore this point, a constant reminder of the divine gaze watching over every medieval union. With the Church's blessing becoming increasingly central, the next stage of the medieval wedding was often a public spectacle, designed to impress and involve the entire community. The wedding procession, this wasn't a quiet, intimate walk. It was a vibrant, often boisterous display of familial pride and communal celebration. You might find yourself caught up in the throng, the muddy path beneath your feet, the air alive with the sounds of voices, simple music, and perhaps the lowing of cattle being led as part of the dowry. The mainstream historical fact is that wedding processions were a common and significant feature of medieval weddings, particularly for the noble and wealthy. The size and grandeur of the procession were directly tied to the social status of the families involved. For a peasant wedding, it might be a small group of family and close friends walking from the bride's home to the local parish church, perhaps accompanied by a fiddler or a flutist. For a noble wedding, however, it could be a truly magnificent affair. A long train of richly dressed guests, mounted knights, servants carrying banners, musicians playing loud pipes and drums, and perhaps even wagons laden with the dowry goods, parading through the village or town. Imagine trying to explain to a modern bride that her wedding entrance involves a literal parade of her inherited livestock. The procession served multiple purposes. Firstly, it was a public declaration of the marriage, a visible affirmation of the union that had been announced through the banns. Everyone could see it, making the contract undeniably public. Secondly, it was a display of wealth, power, and prestige. A grand procession showcased the family's importance and their ability to host such an event, boosting their social standing within the community and beyond. Thirdly, it was a means of gathering witnesses. All those people lining the streets, or following behind, could later attest to the fact that the marriage took place. You might find yourself elbowing a fellow villager for a better view, marveling at the rich fabrics of the noble women or the sheer number of armed guards accompanying the groom's party. There's a quirky tidbit about the route itself. Sometimes, the procession would deliberately take a circuitous path, winding through the village or town, to ensure maximum visibility and allow as many people as possible to witness the event. It wasn't about the shortest distance between 2 points. It was about the greatest number of eyeballs. You can imagine the gossips of the village setting up shop along the route, critiquing everything from the bride's attire to the number of servants. In some regions, certain traditional stops were made along the way, perhaps at the local well for a symbolic drink or at a crossroads for a blessing. These customs, while varying, all underscored the communal nature of the event. The atmosphere of the procession could range from solemn and formal to joyous and celebratory, while the immediate family might maintain a dignified composure. The accompanying guests and villagers would often be more boisterous, shouting blessings, throwing grain for fertility, or playing music. It was a day for the community to come together, to share in the joy, and to reaffirm the social bonds that held their world together. The air would be filled not just with human voices, but perhaps the neighing of horses, the jingling of harness bells, and the occasional squawk of a chicken protesting its inclusion in the dowry display. Historians still argue about the precise significance of these processions for different social classes. While we have ample evidence of elaborate noble processions, were peasant processions equally important, albeit on a smaller scale, for community recognition? Or were they sometimes bypassed altogether due to economic constraints? Regardless, for those who participated or witnessed, the wedding procession was an undeniable force, drawing everyone into the narrative of a new union. It was the visual prologue to the vows, setting the stage with pomp and circumstance, or humble sincerity, depending on the status of the soon-to-be-wed couple. You feel the ground vibrate slightly as a cart laden with provisions rumbles past, carrying not just food for the feast, but the very essence of a new life beginning. Having witnessed the impressive, perhaps even chaotic, wedding procession, you finally arrive at the heart of the matter, the ceremony, simple, yet profound vows. Gone are the bustling streets and curious onlookers, at least for a moment. You're now standing within the hushed confines of a medieval church, the air cool and faintly musty, illuminated by the flickering glow of candles. This is where the solemn exchange of promises takes place, transforming a secular agreement into a divine bond. The mainstream historical fact is that the medieval wedding ceremony itself, particularly by the later Middle Ages, was surprisingly brief and straightforward compared to many modern, elaborate rites. It typically took place at the church door or in the church porch, as we discussed, a key strategy for the church to assert its authority before moving inside for the nuptial. Mass, the core of the ceremony, involved the mutual consent of the bride and groom, expressed through simple spoken vows. The priest would often ask the couple directly if they took each other as husband and wife, and their affirmative "I do," or the Latin equivalent, was the crucial moment that legally and spiritually bound them. This verbal consent, given freely and publicly, was the cornerstone of a valid marriage. Following the vows, a ring was exchanged. This ring, typically simple and unadorned, was placed on the fourth finger of the bride's left hand, a tradition that goes back to ancient beliefs about a vena amoris, or vein of love, running directly from that finger to the heart. It was a tangible symbol of the marital bond, a public declaration of her new status. Sometimes, a ring might also be given to the groom, though this was less universal. The ring served as a constant physical reminder of the solemn promises made, a small, circular anchor in a turbulent world. Here's a quirky tidbit. While the modern "you may kiss the bride" is a familiar conclusion, the medieval ceremony often included a communal kiss of peace, sometimes shared among the couple and the priest, or even with close family members. It was a symbolic gesture of unity and blessing, not necessarily a romantic display. Imagine the awkwardness of sharing a formal peck with your new father-in-law, all in the name of marital harmony. This small ritual underscored the communal and spiritual aspects of the union far more than any passionate embrace. Historians still argue about the precise evolution of the wedding kiss and its varying social meanings across different regions and centuries of the medieval period. Was it always a chaste blessing, or did it carry more romantic undertones in some contexts? After the vows and the ring exchange, the couple might then enter the church for the nuptial mass, a special service dedicated to blessing the newly married pair. During this mass, the couple would often kneel at the altar, and the priest would offer prayers and blessings specifically for their fertility and happiness. This part of the ceremony emphasized the sacramental nature of marriage, appealing to divine grace to consecrate their union. You might hear the resonant tones of Latin prayers, the soft rustle of robes, and feel the solemnity of the moment. A stark contrast to the earlier street festivities, the profound simplicity of the medieval vows is striking. There were no lengthy personal speeches, no elaborate readings. The emphasis was on the direct, unequivocal declaration of intent. It reflected a society that valued clarity and adherence to tradition over individual expression. Every gesture, every word had meaning, rooted in centuries of custom and increasingly the dictates of the church. You might even find yourself contemplating the strength of a commitment made with such brevity, without the need for flowery language, relying instead on the sheer weight of public declaration and divine sanction. This simple act at the church door was the pivot around which entire family destinies turned, a powerful testament to the enduring human need for ritual and recognition of new beginnings. The soft echo of their "I do" seems to hang in the air, sealing their fate. You've just witnessed the solemn exchange of vows at the church door, the very bedrock of a valid medieval marriage. But before the church fully cemented its grip on marriage rituals, another, much older tradition persisted, especially in some regions. Handfasting, a pre-church tradition, lingers. This ancient custom highlights the fascinating blend of pagan roots and emerging Christian influence that characterized much of medieval life. You might observe a simpler, more rustic gathering, perhaps outdoors or in a humble dwelling, where the focus is on a tangible, physical bond. The mainstream historical fact is that handfasting was an ancient, pre-Christian betrothal or marriage custom that involved the literal binding of the couple's hands together, often with a cord, ribbon, or piece of cloth. This symbolic act signified their mutual commitment and the formation of their union. While the church increasingly sought to formalize marriage within its walls, handfasting remained recognized, particularly in areas like Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Scandinavia, and even informally in some English regions. It was a verbal and physical contract, often without the direct involvement of a priest, relying instead on the presence of witnesses and the public declaration of intent. This tradition predated formal Christian marriage ceremonies and was rooted in Germanic and Celtic legal customs. It represented a solemn oath, an agreement between two people to live as husband and wife for a specified period, often a year and a day, or sometimes for life. If it was for a limited time, and after that period they wished to make it permanent, they would then either renew their vows or proceed with a church ceremony. If they decided not to continue, they could part ways without stigma, a surprisingly flexible arrangement for the era. This made handfasting a kind of probationary marriage, an intriguing precursor to what we might call a modern trial separation, but conducted before the permanent commitment. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some remote areas, especially those where priests were scarce or the population held on to older customs, handfasting could serve as the sole form of marriage. Legally recognized by the community, if not always enthusiastically endorsed by the church hierarchy. These were unions by consent and cohabitation, with a physical act of joining hands, followed by living together as man and wife, was enough to establish a valid marriage in the eyes of local custom and common law. Imagine the logistical nightmare for a traveling bishop trying to track down all the imperfect marriages in his diocese. Historians still argue about how widespread, truly informal, non-clerical handfasting remained by the later Middle Ages, particularly after the Church's strong push for sacramental marriage. Was it a tenacious holdover, or did it mostly fade into obscurity, becoming a mere betrothal custom rather than a full marriage? The act of handfasting itself was quite simple. The couple would stand facing each other, and a witness, or sometimes a designated elder or even a local leader, if a priest wasn't involved, would bind their right hands together. As their hands were bound, they would speak their vows, promising to be loyal and true to one another. It was a tangible, physical representation of their lives being intertwined, a visible knot of their commitment. You might hear the soft rustle of the cloth as their hands are tied, followed by the earnest, perhaps slightly trembling, voices of the bride and groom. Even as the church increasingly imposed its formal rites, elements of handfasting were sometimes incorporated into official betrothal ceremonies or even wedding blessings, particularly at the church door. It was a way for the older customs to persist and blend with the newer, Christianized rituals. This shows the remarkable adaptability of medieval society, where ancient traditions weren't simply erased but often subtly woven into the fabric of evolving practices. So, while the grand cathedrals might dominate your view of medieval religion, remember that underneath, in the quiet corners and remote villages, older, more earthy customs like handfasting continued to echo, reminding you that not every medieval union began with bell towers and Latin liturgy. You've explored the physical act of handfasting and the solemnity of church vows. But whether the ceremony was simple or grand, at the heart of its validity, beyond divine blessing or family contract, lay one undeniable element: witnesses, crucial for legal standing. In a world without widespread birth certificates, national registries, or digital archives, the presence of reliable witnesses was the ultimate stamp of legitimacy for a medieval marriage. You might find yourself positioned amongst a small cluster of solemn-faced individuals, their eyes keenly observing every gesture and listening to every word. Knowing their testimony could one day be vital, the mainstream historical fact is that the presence of witnesses was absolutely essential for a medieval marriage to be considered valid and enforceable, both by secular and ecclesiastical law. A marriage, even one performed with mutual consent, could be challenged if there were no credible witnesses to attest to its occurrence. These witnesses weren't just decorative. They were the living memory and legal record of the union. They could be called upon, sometimes years later, to confirm that the vows were spoken, the consent was given, and the customary rituals were performed. Imagine being called to court, decades after a wedding, to swear on your life that you saw Lady Eleanor say "I do too, Sir Reginald," and not "I'd rather eat stale bread." For this reason, families would carefully select their witnesses. These were typically respected members of the community, close relatives, or trusted friends whose word carried weight. Their social standing and good reputation added credibility to their testimony. For noble weddings, witnesses might include other lords, influential clergy, or prominent merchants. For peasant weddings, it would be the village elders, the parish priest, or perhaps the local miller and blacksmith. The more important the marriage, the more important the witnesses. You might see them nodding sagely, their faces reflecting the gravity of their role, knowing they were participating in the creation of a new, legally recognized entity. Here's a quirky tidbit. To ensure the witnesses remembered the event clearly, especially if they were commoners who might not be accustomed to formal proceedings, there were sometimes rather memorable and slightly jarring traditions. In some regions, a witness might be given a small, symbolic slap or even a gentle box on the ear at the wedding. The slight pain meant to help them remember the day for years to come. Imagine trying to explain that to your lawyer when preparing for a deposition. Historians still argue about the true prevalence and efficacy of such physical memory aids. Were they genuinely helpful, or simply a folk custom meant to add a touch of levity or perhaps bewilderment to an otherwise serious occasion? You're left to wonder if the priest ever accidentally slapped the wrong person. Beyond simply remembering the event, witnesses also served as a kind of moral guarantor. Their presence publicly acknowledged the union, making it harder for either party to deny the marriage later or to claim a pre-contract with another individual. It was a communal safeguard against deception and bigamy. In an era where communication was slow and records could be lost, human testimony was paramount. The act of witnessing was a reciprocal agreement. You vouched for the couple, and in turn, the community implicitly vouched for you. You can almost feel the quiet tension as the priest or officiant looks directly at the witnesses, perhaps even calling out their names, implicitly acknowledging their future role. Their nods, their solemn expressions, are as important as the vows themselves. Without them, the carefully constructed legal and social edifice of the medieval marriage could crumble. So, the next time you're asked to be a witness at a modern wedding, spare a thought for your medieval counterparts, whose role was not just ceremonial, but foundational to the very legitimacy of the union. They weren't just guests, they were the human archives of the time, carrying the weight of matrimonial truth on their shoulders. With the vows exchanged and the witnesses confirmed, the solemnity of the church gives way to a much livelier affair, feasting, the stomach of the celebration. This wasn't just a polite meal. It was often the most extravagant and memorable part of the medieval wedding, a lavish display of generosity and a crucial element of communal bonding. You find yourself immersed in a cacophony of sound, laughter, shouted conversations, the clatter of wooden trenchers, and perhaps the enthusiastic slurping of mead. The air is thick with the tantalizing aroma of roasting meats, herbs, and warm bread. The mainstream historical fact is that the wedding feast, often called the wedding breakfast, even if held in the afternoon, was an indispensable part of medieval marriage celebrations across all social classes. For the nobility and wealthy merchants, these feasts could be truly monumental affairs, lasting for days, involving dozens of courses, and requiring vast quantities of food and drink. Imagine whole roasted animals, boars, venison, swans, peacocks, often redressed in their feathers for display, laid out on enormous tables. There would be pies filled with various meats, elaborate jellies, spiced bread, and sweet treats. The goal was to impress, to display wealth and hospitality, and to cement the social standing of the families involved. The sheer logistics of preparing such a feast in a medieval kitchen, without modern refrigeration or appliances, is a feat in itself. For peasants, the feast would be more modest but no less important. It might involve a communal potluck, with each family contributing what they could. A freshly baked loaf, some cheese, a stew made from the leanest cuts of meat, and plenty of local ale or cider. While the fare was simpler, the spirit of celebration and community was just as strong. It was a rare occasion for everyone to eat their fill, to enjoy rare delicacies, and to escape the usual dietary monotony. You might see a sturdy table set up in the village square, laden with simple but plentiful fare, the villagers' faces glowing with contentment and the warmth of shared merriment. The feast served several crucial functions beyond mere sustenance. Firstly, it was a symbolic act of generosity and hospitality, demonstrating the host family's ability to provide and care for their guests. Secondly, it was a social gathering where members of both families and the wider community could mingle, forge new connections, and solidify existing alliances. Eating together was a powerful act of communal acceptance and unity. Thirdly, it was an opportunity for celebration and revelry, releasing the tension of the formal ceremony and ushering in a period of joy. You might find yourself reaching for a piece of roasted fowl, marveling at the simple pleasure of good food and company. Here's a quirky tidbit. The food itself often carried symbolic meaning. Specific dishes might be served to promote fertility, ward off evil, or bring good luck. For example, nuts were often eaten for their association with abundance and fertility. In some wealthier households, incredibly elaborate subtleties, edible sculptures made from marzipan or other confections were presented, depicting allegorical scenes or coats of arms meant to amaze and entertain the guests. Imagine seeing a sugar castle complete with tiny, edible knights jousting on its ramparts. Historians still argue about the true extent to which such symbolic foods were consciously understood by all guests, or if they simply became part of the broader celebratory tradition. But it's clear that medieval feasting was far more than just filling your stomach. It was a multi-sensory experience packed with meaning. Beyond the sheer volume of food, the medieval feast was also characterized by its communal nature. Everyone ate together, often from shared trenchers, stale bread used as plates, later given to the poor or dogs, using knives and fingers, as forks were not widely adopted until much later. The seating arrangements, especially in noble households, were highly hierarchical, with the most important guests seated at the high table. You might find yourself seated on a bench, jostling for space, but feeling a genuine connection to the people around you, all sharing in the bounty. The air thrums with a palpable sense of contentment and well-being. The shared food forging bonds that formal contracts could only hint at. This lavish consumption marked the official end of the formal proceedings and the beginning of a joyous new chapter for the newly wedded couple. The clatter of trenchers and the aroma of roasted meats still linger in the air. But as the medieval wedding feast continues, another vital element comes to the fore. Music and entertainment. Merriment ensues. A wedding was not just a meal. It was a festival, a communal release of joy, and often a chance for rare indulgence in entertainment. You can feel the shift in the atmosphere from polite consumption to outright revelry, the rhythmic beat of a drum or the lilting tune of a lute filling the hall. The mainstream historical fact is that music, singing, storytelling, and various Forms of performance were integral parts of medieval wedding celebrations. For the wealthy, this might involve hired professional musicians, minstrels, jongleurs, and troubadours, who would play instruments like lutes, harps, flutes, pipes, and drums. They would perform songs, recite epic poems, tell witty anecdotes, and sometimes even juggle or perform acrobatics. The goal was to keep the guests entertained for hours, providing a sophisticated backdrop to the feasting and conversation. Imagine a troupe of performers setting up in the corner of a grand hall, their melodies weaving through the chatter, offering a much-needed respite from the day-to-day grind of medieval life. For peasant weddings, the entertainment would be simpler, but no less heartfelt. Local musicians would bring out their fiddles, pipes, or drums. Villagers would sing traditional songs, tell folk tales, and engage in communal dances. These dances, often simple circle or line dances, were a fundamental part of the celebration, allowing everyone to participate and reinforcing community bonds. You might find yourself tapping your foot or even being pulled into a lively dance. The sheer infectious joy overcoming any initial shyness. The energy in the room would be palpable, a joyous release from the anxieties of daily survival. The types of entertainment varied greatly by region and social class. In some areas, mummers masked performers who acted out short plays or skits might appear. In others, particularly at noble courts, there might be more elaborate displays, such as mock jousts or hunting demonstrations on the grounds outside the castle. The aim was always to create an atmosphere of festivity and abundance, allowing guests to temporarily forget their worries and immerse themselves in the celebration. It wasn't just about making noise. It was about creating a shared experience of collective happiness. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, jesters or fools were employed, not just for their comedic value, but also for their perceived ability to ward off evil spirits. Their antics and laughter were believed to create a joyful noise that would scare away any malevolent entities that might wish ill upon the newlyweds. So, while you might laugh at their jokes, their presence had a deeper, more superstitious purpose. Historians still argue about the precise line between genuine entertainment and superstitious ritual in many medieval customs. Was the jester truly considered a supernatural guardian, or was that explanation merely a convenient excuse to enjoy some bawdy humor? You're left to wonder if the bride secretly slipped the jester an extra coin, just in case. Games and playful activities were also common. These could range from simple riddles and storytelling competitions to more vigorous outdoor games for the younger attendees, such as wrestling or races. For the adults, drinking games and dice games were popular pastimes, contributing to the convivial atmosphere. The consumption of ale, wine, and mead would flow freely, loosening tongues and encouraging merriment. You might see a group huddled in a corner, roaring with laughter over a particularly bad joke, or a young man clumsily attempting to impress a maiden with his dancing skills. The entertainment at a medieval wedding was more than just a diversion. It was a crucial part of the social glue that held communities together. It marked the transition of the couple into their new life, celebrated their union, and allowed everyone to share in the joy and hope for their future prosperity. As the music swells and the laughter echoes, you feel a profound sense of connection to these people, united in their simple desire for happiness and good fortune. The air vibrates with the rhythm of life itself, a joyous affirmation of community and new beginnings. The echoes of music and laughter still resonate from the feast. But, as the merriment continues, another medieval custom comes into focus: Wedding gifts, practicality over extravagance. Forget elaborate registries, honeymoon funds, or perfectly curated wish lists. In the medieval world, gifts for the newlyweds were rarely about sentimental value or personal preference. They were about survival, utility, and the practical necessities of establishing a new household. You might find yourself observing the humble exchange of goods, understanding that each item, no matter how small, held significant value. The mainstream historical fact is that wedding gifts in the Middle Ages were overwhelmingly practical. For peasant families, gifts would consist of items essential for daily life and work: livestock, a chicken, a goat, perhaps even a young pig; farming tools, a sturdy hoe, a scythe, or a sharpening stone; household implements, a new cooking pot, wooden bowls, linen cloths; or raw materials, a bolt of wool, a measure of grain. These were not luxury items. They were the building blocks of a new household, directly contributing to the couple's ability to feed themselves and work their land. Imagine a young couple beaming with genuine gratitude over the gift of a healthy milking cow, a far cry from today's excitement over a new espresso machine. For wealthier families, gifts might be more valuable, but still retained a strong sense of utility. Fine linens for the bed, silver tableware more for display and investment than daily use. Sturdy furniture, or perhaps even a small piece of land or a valuable animal like a war. Jewels and precious metals were given, but often as a form of portable wealth or investment rather than purely for adornment. A noble bride might receive a beautifully embroidered tapestry, not just for its beauty, but for its warmth and its ability to add prestige to her new home. You'd see fewer novelty items, and more things that could genuinely improve the quality of life, or the financial standing of the new couple. The giving of gifts was deeply embedded in the social fabric. It was a communal act of support for the newlyweds, helping them to establish their independent lives. It also served to reinforce social bonds between families and neighbors. The expectation was that everyone who attended the wedding, if they could afford it, would contribute something. This wasn't just generosity, it was a reciprocal obligation, acknowledging the social contract of mutual aid within the community. You might see a farmer presenting a sack of grain, or a weaver offering a bolt of hand-spun yarn, each gift a testament to their trade and their support. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, guests would present bride ale, which was not just beer, for the celebration, but specifically brewed ale intended to be sold by the bride to help her raise some initial capital for her new household. This was a direct, entrepreneurial form of gift-giving, transforming the celebration into a small fundraiser for the couple's future. Imagine a modern wedding where the guests buy the beer and the proceeds go directly to the couple's mortgage. Historians still argue about how widespread this practice was and its exact economic impact on nascent households, but it certainly offers a unique glimpse into medieval financial ingenuity. Beyond the material gifts, blessings and good wishes were also considered incredibly important. Guests would offer prayers for fertility, prosperity, and a long, happy life together. These intangible gifts of goodwill were valued just as highly as the physical ones, reflecting the deep-seated belief in the power of collective well-wishing in a world that often felt precarious. So, while you might not see any perfectly wrapped presents or gift cards, every item exchanged at a medieval wedding, whether it was a prized pig or a simple wooden spoon, was a tangible expression of support and hope for the newlyweds' future. They were building a life, not just celebrating a day, and every gift was a brick in that foundation. With the feasting and gift-giving winding down, The atmosphere in the medieval hall shifts from boisterous revelry to something a little more intimate and surprisingly public. We're now moving towards what might be the most eye-opening aspect of a medieval wedding night: the bridal chamber, public bedding ritual. Forget discreet good nights and private bedroom retreats. In this era, the journey to the marital bed was often a communal event, steeped in tradition and witnessed by many. You might find yourself feeling a peculiar mix of awkwardness and historical fascination as you observe this peculiar bygone custom. The mainstream historical fact is that the bedding ceremony was a common and often public ritual, particularly among the nobility and gentry, though elements of it existed in various forms across social classes. After the feast, the bride would be formally escorted to the marital bedchamber by the women of the wedding party, while the groom would be escorted by the men. This was not a moment of quiet retreat. Guests, especially close family and friends, would often accompany them, singing Bodhi songs, offering ribald jokes, and helping to prepare the couple for bed. It was a boisterous procession, ensuring that the union was publicly acknowledged, right up to the very threshold of intimacy. The purpose of this public display was multifaceted. Firstly, it served as a ceremonial transition, marking the moment the couple truly began their life together as husband and wife. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, it provided witnesses to the fact that the couple were indeed retiring to the same bed. This was crucial for proving the future consummation of the marriage, which, as we'll discuss, was vital for its legal validity. In an age where marriage was a contract with enormous implications for property and lineage, ensuring undeniable proof of the union's physical commencement was paramount. Imagine having your aunts and uncles sing questionable songs while you try to get into your night clothes. It truly puts a new spin on awkward family moments. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some traditions, the bedding ceremony might involve a ritualistic blessing of the marital bed by a priest, who would sprinkle holy water and offer prayers for fertility and blessed offspring. While the church generally frowned upon excessive bawdiness, it understood the need for public witness and sought to imbue the act with spiritual sanctity. So, you might have the unique experience of hearing solemn Latin prayers immediately followed by a chorus of raucous laughter and crude jests from the assembled guests. Historians still argue about the precise balance between religious solemnity and folk revelry in these ceremonies. Was the religious blessing an attempt to temper the earthier elements, or did it simply add another layer of legitimacy to a fundamentally secular folk custom? Once in the chamber, the guests would often help the couple undress, or at least divest them of their more formal outer garments, sometimes even throwing a stocking at the groom for good luck. The couple might then be placed in the bed, often with plenty of jovial encouragement and advice. The chamber might be decorated with flowers and herbs, believed to promote fertility and ward off evil spirits. Wine or spiced drinks might be offered to the couple. And then, finally, the guests would largely depart, leaving the couple to their private moments, often with a final round of well wishes and perhaps one last burst of off-key singing. The degree of publicness varied. For peasants, it might be more intimate, perhaps just close family or a few trusted neighbors helping the couple to their simple straw mattress. But even then, the community knew the union was being consummated. For the nobility, the custom could be quite grand, with a sizable retinue of guests crowding the chamber. This custom, while jarring to modern sensibilities, reflected a very different cultural understanding of privacy and the collective stake in a marriage. It wasn't about voyeurism, It was about public validation and the shared hope for a fruitful union. You might find yourself blushing on behalf of the medieval newlyweds, but you can't deny the powerful statement this ritual made. This marriage, in all its aspects, was now an undeniable reality, witnessed by all. You've just witnessed the somewhat bewildering, yet entirely practical, public bedding ritual. Now, you arrive at the culmination of the medieval marriage process, a step that, while private in its execution, was utterly public in its significance. Consummation, the legal and social requirement. This wasn't merely about intimacy. It was the act that often legally and irrevocably sealed the marriage in the eyes of both church and secular law. You might feel the weight of expectation, sensing the profound pressure on the newlyweds to complete this final, crucial step. The mainstream historical fact is that in medieval Europe, particularly under the evolving canon law of the Church, a marriage was often not considered fully valid or absolutely indissoluble until it had been physically consummated. While the exchange of vows created a legal and spiritual bond, the physical union was seen as the ultimate confirmation and completion of the sacrament. This meant sexual intercourse. If a marriage was not consummated, it could be annulled, making it as if the marriage had never happened. This put immense pressure on the newly married couple, as the future of their union and the legitimacy of any potential heirs hinged on this intimate act. Imagine the immense unspoken tension in that marital chamber after the guests, finally, departed, knowing the legal validity of your entire life hinged on this single, intimate act. The reason for this legal emphasis on consummation was Firstly, it reflected the Church's theological understanding of marriage as a union mirroring that of Christ and the Church, a complete and fertile bond. Secondly, and more pragmatically, consummation was often seen as proof of a genuine and uncoerced consent, particularly for marriages arranged from infancy. If a couple, upon reaching the age of consent, did not consummate their marriage, it could be taken as an indication that their initial consent was not truly free or full, thus providing grounds for annulment. And thirdly, in a society obsessed with lineage and inheritance, consummation was the precursor to procreation, which was the primary social function of marriage. No children, no continuation of the line, no clear heir to the property. Here's a quirky tidbit. While the act itself was private, the expectation of it, and sometimes even evidence of it, was not. In some noble households, particularly for important dynastic marriages, there might be a physical inspection the morning after to confirm consummation. This could involve an attending midwife or a trusted female relative who would examine the bride, looking for evidence, such as a stained sheet, to verify that the marriage had been physically completed. This was, of course, an incredibly invasive and mortifying practice by modern standards, highlighting the extreme emphasis placed on this aspect of the union. Historians still argue about how widespread and regular such physical inspections truly were, or if they were largely confined to high-stakes, royal and noble marriages. Was it truly a common legal requirement, or more of a symbolic reassurance for anxious families? You might feel a distinct sense of relief that your own private moments are well private. Failure to consummate a marriage could lead to its annulment, a process distinct from divorce, which was almost impossible for most medieval people. Annulment meant the Church declared that a valid marriage had never existed in the first place, often due to an impediment present at the time of the wedding, or, crucially, the lack of consummation. This was often sought by couples or their families when a strategic marriage proved barren or undesirable. providing a rare escape hatch from an otherwise unbreakable bond. So, as the last of the guests retreat from the bridal chamber, leaving the nervous newlyweds alone, you understand that this night is not just about personal intimacy. It's about fulfilling a contract, securing an inheritance, and ensuring the legitimacy of future generations. The privacy of the marital bed held immense public consequence, making the act of consummation a pivotal moment in the medieval marital journey. The silence that falls over the chamber is heavy with this profound responsibility, a stark contrast to the boisterous revelry of hours before. The heavy silence of the bridal chamber, laden with the weight of expectation, now gives way to the peculiar formalities of the morning after. If the bedding ritual was surprisingly public, then the next step, for some, was even more startling. Morning after proof, a somewhat awkward affair. This wasn't about a leisurely breakfast in bed. It was about verification, especially for unions of great importance, ensuring that the critical act of consummation had, in fact, taken place. You might find yourself cringing on behalf of the newlyweds, witnessing a custom that utterly defies modern notions of privacy. The mainstream historical fact is that in high-status marriages, particularly those involving royalty or powerful noble families, where the continuation of a lineage and the secure transfer of property were paramount, some form of verification of consummation was indeed practiced the morning after the wedding. This could involve the testimony of attending women, such as midwives, noble ladies, or close female relatives who had been present during the bedding ceremony and might inspect the marital bed for evidence, like a stained sheet. The purpose was to provide incontrovertible proof that the marriage had been physically completed, leaving no doubt as to its legal validity and the legitimacy of any future offspring. Imagine the new bride, perhaps still reeling from the night's events, having to face an inspection by a group of solemn-faced older women. It's enough to make you wish for a hidden camera, if only to record the sheer awkwardness. This practice, while invasive, stemmed from the critical importance of consummation for legal validation. Without it, a marriage could be annulled, potentially, throwing dynastic succession or property inheritance into chaos. Therefore, families with immense stakes in the union sought to ensure there was no ambiguity. The physical evidence, combined with the testimony of witnesses from the bedding ceremony, created a robust, if humiliating, legal record. This wasn't about prurience. It was about pragmatism and ensuring the future of entire noble lines. Here's a quirky tidbit in some extreme cases, or for truly skeptical families. The groom might even be asked to provide an affidavit or testimony to affirm the consummation, particularly if there was any doubt or a challenge was anticipated. While less common than the female inspection, it underscores the lengths to which medieval society would go to secure proof. Imagine the groom, perhaps looking a bit disheveled, having to solemnly swear before a notary that he had, indeed, performed his marital duties. Historians still argue about the precise motivations behind such extreme measures. Were they genuinely driven by legal necessity, or did they sometimes serve as a subtle form of control over the young couple, ensuring adherence to familial expectations? You're left pondering the sheer lack of personal space afforded to these individuals. Even in the most intimate moments, beyond direct physical inspection, the mere fact that the couple had retired to the bedchamber together, witnessed by the wedding party, and emerged the next morning as a publicly recognized married couple, often served as sufficient proof for most commoners. The community's collective knowledge and acceptance were, for them, a powerful form of validation. For these folks, the spectacle of the bedding ritual itself was often enough. But for those at the pinnacle of society, where kingdoms and vast estates hung in the balance, a higher standard of proof was often desired. This morning after ritual, however uncomfortable it appears to modern eyes, serves as a powerful reminder of how medieval society viewed marriage as a contractual and reproductive institution first and foremost. The personal feelings of the individuals involved were secondary to the greater social and legal imperatives. So, as the older women nod their approval and quietly disperse from the bridal chamber, you feel the tension in the room ease, knowing that another hurdle has been cleared. The marriage is now fully validated, and the future of the family line, for better or worse, is secure. It's a stark illustration of a world where even the most intimate acts carried immense public and legal weight. You've witnessed the complete journey to the marital bed, including its most awkward morning after formalities, sealing the medieval union. But what happened when these meticulously arranged marriages, despite all their careful planning and public ceremony, simply didn't work out? Or, perhaps more accurately, when they were deemed never to have truly existed in the first place? This brings us to a concept very different from modern divorce: annulment, when marriages went wrong. This was the medieval escape hatch, a legal declaration that could unravel a union, though it was far from easy to obtain. You're now stepping into the realm of ecclesiastical courts, where theological doctrine and human desperation often clashed. The mainstream historical fact is that in medieval Europe, particularly from the 12th century onwards, outright divorce, meaning the legal dissolution of a valid marriage, allowing both parties to remarry, was virtually impossible under the prevailing canon law of the Catholic Church. Marriage was considered a sacrament, a divinely ordained, indissoluble bond. However, the Church did allow for annulment, which was fundamentally different. An annulment was a declaration that a valid marriage had, in fact, never existed in the first place, due to some impediment present at the time the vows were exchanged. It wasn't dissolving a marriage. It was declaring it null and void from its very inception, as if it had never happened. The grounds for annulment were numerous, and often complex, but they primarily fell into categories that demonstrated a fundamental flaw in the marriage's legality. The most common grounds included: 1. Pre-contract. One of the parties had previously entered into a binding betrothal or marriage with someone else. Remember how important betrothals were. If a prior one existed and was valid, it nullified any subsequent marriage. 2. Consanguinity or affinity. The parties were too closely related by blood consanguinity or by marriage affinity, according to the Church's strict rules. This was a frequent ground, particularly for noble families who intermarried ostensibly. 3. Non-consummation, as we just discussed. If the marriage was never physically consummated, it could be annulled. This was a particularly potent ground, especially if one party genuinely refused or was physically unable. 4. Lack of true consent. If either party could prove they were coerced into the marriage and did not give their free and uncoerced consent, an annulment might be granted. This was difficult to prove, especially for women, but not impossible. 5. Impotence or madness. Permanent impotence on the part of one spouse, or verifiable madness that prevented true understanding and consent, could also be grounds. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the most famous medieval annulments, or rather, the attempt at one, was King Henry VIII's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. primarily on grounds of affinity. She had been married to his deceased brother, Arthur. While this ultimately led to the English Reformation, it perfectly illustrates the central role of annulment as the only avenue for separating from a royal spouse and the intense political stakes involved. Imagine the legal and theological wrangling, the endless debates as armies of scholars argued over arcane biblical interpretations, all to determine if a king's marriage was truly valid. Historians still argue about the extent to which powerful individuals could effectively, by annulments, through political pressure or generous donations to the church, manipulating the system to their advantage. Was it a genuine search for theological truth, or often just a convenient tool for powerful elites? You might find yourself sympathizing with poor Catherine, caught in this theological and political maelstrom. The process of obtaining an annulment was lengthy, expensive, and public. It involved petitioning an ecclesiastical court, presenting evidence, calling witnesses, including those who witnessed the original wedding and possibly the morning after proof, and often enduring years of legal proceedings. It was a humiliating process for both parties, with intimate details of their private lives laid bare. Despite the difficulties, annulment provided a crucial, albeit narrow, means for individuals, especially those with resources, to escape an unbearable or politically inconvenient union. So, while the phrase "till death do us part" was the guiding principle, the medieval world did offer a pathway, albeit a challenging one, for marriages to be dissolved, not by divorce, but by a declaration that they had never truly begun. It was a complex theological and legal dance, reminding you that even in a seemingly rigid society, there were always avenues, however difficult, to navigate the intricate tapestry of human relationships. You've just peered into the complex world of annulment, the medieval way out of an invalid marriage. Now, let's explicitly address the stark reality that followed. Divorce, a concept mostly absent, while our modern society readily accepts divorce as a legal pathway to end a marriage. The medieval mindset, heavily shaped by the church, held a fundamentally different view. You're entering a world where "till death do us part" wasn't just a romantic ideal, but a rigid legal and theological commandment, making separation incredibly rare and fraught with complications. The mainstream historical fact is that within the Latin Christian West during the Middle Ages, the concept of divorce as a complete dissolution of a valid, consummated marriage, allowing both parties to remarry, simply did not exist. The Church taught that marriage, once properly contracted and consummated, was a divinely ordained, indissoluble sacrament. What God had joined together, no man could put asunder. This principle, stemming from biblical interpretations, was a cornerstone of medieval canon law and profoundly influenced social norms. You might feel a sense of claustrophobia realizing the sheer finality of a medieval marriage. There was no undo button once it was truly sealed. This stark reality meant that couples trapped in unhappy, abusive, or barren marriages had very few avenues for relief. Annulment, as we just discussed, was the only way to legally escape a marriage, but it required proving that the marriage was never valid in the first place, not that it had simply failed. It was a declaration of nullity, not a dissolution. For the vast majority of medieval people, if their marriage was valid and consummated, they were bound for life. However, while divorce in the modern sense was absent, there was a form of legal separation that allowed couples to live apart, known as divorce, a mensa et thro, meaning from bed and board. This separation permitted spouses to live separately and independently, sometimes with a formal division of property. But they remained legally married in the eyes of the church. Neither party was permitted to remarry as long as the other spouse was alive. This was often granted on grounds of cruelty, adultery, or extreme incompatibility. Imagine living effectively as a single person, but forever barred from finding a new partner. A kind of perpetual purgatory of marital limbo. Here's a quirky tidbit. Because outright divorce was forbidden, resourceful and often desperate individuals sometimes resorted to rather creative and often scandalous claims for annulment. We see cases where people would claim an unrevealed impediment like impotence, even feigning it, or dig deep into genealogical records to find a distant, forgotten kinship link that would render their marriage invalid. Sometimes these claims were genuine, but often they were thinly veiled attempts to escape an undesirable union without the ability to truly divorce. Historians still argue about the moral implications of these strategic annulments. Were they a pragmatic workaround to rigid laws, or a cynical manipulation of religious doctrine? You're left to wonder about the lengths people went to for a semblance of freedom. The inability to divorce had profound societal implications. It meant that marital disputes, even serious ones, had to be resolved within the confines of the existing union or through separation, immensa et through. This put immense pressure on families and communities to mediate conflicts and often forced individuals to endure difficult circumstances. It also meant that remarriage for most was only possible upon the death of a spouse. This significantly shaped patterns of inheritance, social relationships, and the very concept of family life. So, as you ponder the medieval understanding of matrimony, strip away any modern notions of a clean break. The emphasis was on the sanctity and permanence of the bond. While there were ways to declare a marriage null from the beginning, the idea of simply ending a valid marriage because it wasn't working, and then moving on to a new partner, was almost unthinkable. This rigid framework underscored the immense social and religious weight placed on every single union. A contract not just between two people, but between their souls and God. You've absorbed the strict medieval stance on divorce, understanding that annulment was the only real escape from a flawed union. This rigidity meant that for most, the path to a new marital future only opened through one event: the death of a spouse. So, let's explore the complex social and legal landscape surrounding remarriage. Rules for widows and widowers. This wasn't a simple matter of finding a new partner. It was a decision laden with economic, social, and spiritual considerations. You might observe the subtle dance between grief and pragmatism as individuals contemplated a second walk down the aisle, or rather, to the church door. The mainstream historical fact is that remarriage was common and often encouraged in medieval society, especially for those of childbearing age. But it was subject to various social customs and legal strictures. For men, a widower was generally expected to remarry fairly quickly, particularly if he had land or a household that needed management, or if he needed to secure an heir. A single man, even a wealthy one, was seen as less stable, less complete. Society expected him to be part of a family unit. You might see a relatively young widower, still in mourning, already being presented with potential new brides. The emphasis on practical necessity overriding immediate grief. For widows, the situation was more complex. A young widow, especially one who inherited substantial property like a dower or jointure, was a highly desirable catch. She brought with her established assets and often proved fertility. However, she also faced significant pressure. Her deceased husband's family might try to control her remarriage, fearing the loss of their kinsman's property if she married outside their lineage. Some feudal lords even had the right to arrange their widows' marriages, sometimes to raise revenue or solidify alliances, a practice often resented by the widows themselves. Imagine being a grieving woman, only to find yourself a prime piece of marital real estate, your future dictated by your late husband's family or feudal overlord. Here's a quirky tidbit. While the church didn't forbid remarriage, it generally viewed it as less holy than a first marriage, particularly for women. Second marriages were sometimes called bigamy in a moral, though not legal sense, and special penitential rites or a lesser blessing might apply. Widows who chose not to remarry, especially if they vowed chastity and dedicated themselves to a religious life or pious works, were sometimes held in higher esteem, seen as more spiritually pure. This created a tension for widows, balancing societal pressure to remarry for practical reasons against a subtle spiritual valuing of perpetual widowhood. Historians still argue about the true social stigma attached to second marriages for women. Was it a widely felt moral judgment, or merely a subtle ecclesiastical preference that had little real impact on social acceptance? You're left to wonder if any medieval woman simply wanted to enjoy her newfound independence without a new husband looming. Children from a first marriage also played a significant role. A new spouse meant a new step-parent, and the integration of families could be fraught with challenges, particularly concerning inheritance rights. Prenuptial agreements for remarriages were often even more detailed, meticulously outlining how property would pass to children from both unions. You might witness heated discussions among family members, ensuring that no one's inheritance was unfairly diminished by a new marital bond. The age of the widow or widower was also crucial. An older widow past childbearing age might face less pressure to remarry, perhaps being allowed to live out her days in relative independence, managing her dower lands. For a younger, fertile widow, however, remarriage was almost an expectation, if not a necessity. It was a matter of securing her place in society, protecting her economic interests, and ensuring the continuation of her lineage. So, as you see a middle-aged lord, recently widowed, being introduced to a younger, eligible maiden, you understand that this isn't about rekindling a lost love. It's about pragmatic survival and the relentless march of medieval life. The rules of remarriage were a testament to a society where utility often triumphed over sentiment, even in the shadow of grief. You've seen the strict rules governing marriage and remarriage. But what about those couples who simply lived together as husband and wife, without a formal church ceremony or elaborate contracts? This brings us to the fascinating, sometimes murky, realm of common law marriages, living as spouses. In a world grappling with evolving legal and religious definitions of marriage, these informal unions were often recognized by communities, even if the church held a more skeptical view. You might find yourself observing a couple sharing a small cottage, their lives intertwined, their bond recognized by their neighbors, even without a priest's blessing. The mainstream historical fact is that throughout the Middle Ages, especially in the earlier centuries and in more remote areas, unions based on mutual consent and subsequent cohabitation were often recognized as valid marriages by local custom and secular law. This was known as matrimonium per verba de presente, marriage by words of the present, or matrimonium per verba de futuro, cum copula, marriage by words of the future. followed by intercourse. Essentially, if a man and woman declared their intent to be married now, to presenti or promise to marry in the future, and then had sexual relations, di futuro cum copula, and subsequently lived together as husband and wife, the community often accepted them as married. You might see a village elder simply nodding his approval as a young couple begins to share a hearth, their union as clear as any formal ceremony to the local folk. This informal recognition was particularly prevalent before the church fully solidified its control over marriage as a sacrament. For many commoners, especially peasants who might not have easy access to a priest or the resources for a formal ceremony, these de facto marriages were the practical reality. They were rooted in the idea that marriage was fundamentally about consent and the establishment of a shared household, rather than elaborate rituals. The proof of such a marriage lay in the couple's public behavior. Did they live together? Did they present themselves to the community as spouses? Did they share their property and labor? If so, they were married. Here's a quirky tidbit. The very existence of these common law marriages was a source of considerable tension and confusion for the church. While it eventually pushed for sacramental marriage at the church door, with witnesses, etc., it couldn't simply invalidate all existing unions. This led to a rather intricate legal compromise where consent, even if privately given and then followed by consummation, was considered the core of a valid marriage. The church, however, strongly preferred and increasingly mandated the public ceremony to avoid disputes and ensure proper record-keeping. Imagine a priest sighing deeply, acknowledging a local union because, well, the couple had clearly been living together and having children for years, even if they hadn't bothered with his blessing. Historians still argue about the true numerical proportion of informal versus formal marriages in different periods and regions. Were most medieval marriages technically informal in their initial stages, or was the church's push for formalization largely successful across the board? The flexibility of common law marriage sometimes led to legal disputes, particularly regarding inheritance or legitimacy of children. If a man had multiple common law wives in different villages, or if one party denied consent, proving the validity of the union without formal records could be challenging. This is precisely why the church pushed for public ceremonies and witnesses, as they provided clear, undeniable evidence. You might hear whispers in the village about a disputed common law marriage, the community trying to piece together who truly belonged to whom. Despite the ecclesiastical push for formality, common law marriage persisted as a vital component of medieval life, particularly for those on the margins of society. It offered a practical solution for couples who, for various reasons, could not or chose not to undergo a full church ceremony. It speaks to a more organic, community-driven understanding of human relationships that existed alongside, and sometimes, in tension with the rigid doctrines of the institutional church. You're left with the sense that even in a highly structured society, human ingenuity and basic human needs often found ways to create recognizable bonds, proving that love or at least companionship would always find a way, even without a lavish wedding budget. You've seen the pragmatic realities of medieval marriage, often driven by family strategy and communal recognition, not personal affection. But as the Middle Ages progressed, particularly in the later centuries, a subtle yet profound shift began to emerge. Love matches, a rare, rising notion, while still a secondary consideration for most. The idea that affection and personal choice might play a role in selecting a spouse slowly started to gain traction, challenging the purely Contractual model. You might observe a flicker of genuine fondness in a young couple's eyes, a rare warmth amidst the cold calculations of property and lineage. The mainstream historical fact is that while arranged marriages remained the norm, especially for the propertied classes, the concept of marrying for love, or at least with affection, began to gain intellectual and cultural currency from the 12th century onwards. This shift was heavily influenced by the rise of courtly love literature, troubadour poetry, and new theological interpretations that emphasized the spiritual bond and mutual respect within marriage. Though often highly idealized and initially separate from the practicalities of marriage, these romantic narratives slowly seeped into broader societal consciousness, suggesting that marriage could and perhaps should involve emotional connection. Imagine a young noblewoman secretly poring over a romantic manuscript, dreaming of a love that transcends land deeds and dowries. This doesn't mean medieval. People suddenly started dating like we do today. Far from it. But for some, particularly among the lower gentry, prosperous merchants, or even skilled artisans, where the stakes of a bad alliance weren't quite as catastrophic as for royalty, there might have been a bit more leeway for personal preference. A match that was both financially sensible and personally agreeable was, of course, the ideal. In these cases, families might choose from a pool of suitable candidates, allowing their children some input, or at least permitting a degree of familiarity to develop before the final commitment. You might see a more relaxed courtship, perhaps a shared glance across a village market, or a polite conversation that sparks a flicker of mutual interest. Here's a quirky tidbit to accommodate this burgeoning, yet still constrained, desire for affection. Some families found ingenious ways to allow a form of courtship even within arranged marriages. For instance, prospective noble spouses might be sent to live in the same household for a period, perhaps as children, ostensibly for education or political apprenticeship. This offered them the opportunity to grow up together, observe each other's characters, and potentially develop a genuine bond before the formal marriage vows were exchanged. This wasn't dating, but it was a way to ensure that the individuals weren't complete strangers on their wedding day. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of such trial cohabitations in fostering genuine affection. Did they truly lead to love, or did they simply make arranged marriages slightly less unbearable? You're left to wonder if the medieval equivalent of awkward teen crushes developed in these circumstances. The Church, surprisingly, also played a role in this subtle shift. While it emphasized marriage as a sacrament primarily for procreation and avoiding sin, it also increasingly stressed the importance of mutual consent as fundamental to a valid marriage. If a marriage lacked genuine consent, even if forced by parents, it could be annulled. This gave individuals, especially women, a theoretical, though often very difficult to exercise veto power, subtly empowering personal preference, even if it was rarely explicitly stated as love. The rise of the love match was a slow burn, taking centuries to truly challenge the established order. It wasn't a revolution, but an evolution in cultural perception. By the late Middle Ages, writers and thinkers were increasingly discussing the idea of companionship and affection within marriage, not just its economic or reproductive functions. So, as you observe a young couple, perhaps holding hands beneath the feast table, sharing a secret smile, you recognize the faint stirrings of a new ideal. It's a reminder that even in the most rigid of systems, human emotion, however suppressed, can begin to carve out its own space, slowly reshaping the very definition of what it means to be truly wed. You've glimpsed the nascent spark of love in medieval unions. Now, let's bring our focus down to earth, quite literally, and examine the vast majority of medieval marriages, peasant weddings, modest joys, shared feasts. Forget the grand castles and political machinations. For the common folk who toiled the land, marriage was a simpler, yet equally vital, affair, deeply interwoven with the rhythms of agricultural life. You might find yourself amidst a gathering in a humble village. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth far more prominent than any perfumed noble. The mainstream historical fact is that peasant weddings, while lacking the pomp and ceremony of their noble counterparts, were nonetheless significant communal events, celebrated with earnest joy and pragmatism. For peasants, marriage was fundamentally about the formation of a new economic unit, two individuals combining their labor, resources, and often small plots of land to ensure their mutual survival and prosperity. A young couple wouldn't just marry, they would merge their physical strength and practical skills to work the fields, manage a household, and raise children who would, in turn, contribute to the family's labor. Imagine a strong young man eyeing a diligent young woman, not for her beauty, but for her skill at milking cows or her ability to mend fishing nets. The betrothal for peasants was less about elaborate contracts and more about a verbal agreement between families, often witnessed by a few trusted neighbors or the village elder. The dowry and dower, while present, were practical goods rather than vast sums of money or land. A dowry might consist of a few sheep, a cow, a sturdy loom, a cooking pot, or perhaps a portion of grain from the family's harvest. The dower might be a promise of support from the husband's land should he die, ensuring the widow wouldn't starve. These were tangible assets, directly contributing to the couple's ability to set up a new, albeit humble, home. You might see a young bride proudly leading her dowry cow towards her new dwelling. Every animal an implement, a symbol of their future security. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some peasant communities, the wedding celebration itself was intrinsically linked to the agricultural calendar. Marriages were often timed for periods of less intense farm labor, such as after harvest in late autumn, or during the slack winter months, when there was more time for feasting and communal gathering. This also meant more food was available, fresh from the fields. Imagine planning your wedding around the wheat harvest, knowing that a good yield meant a better feast. Historians still argue about the extent to which these practical considerations always trumped personal desires for a specific wedding date. Was it purely a matter of convenience, or did these seasonal rituals also hold deeper, almost pagan significance for rural communities? The wedding ceremony itself was typically much simpler than a noble one. It would usually take place at the local parish church, often at the church door, presided over by the village priest. The vows would be brief, and the exchange of a simple ring might occur. The true celebration, however, was the feast and communal gathering that followed. This was a collective effort. Neighbors would bring food and drink to share, contributing to a communal meal that was often the most abundant feast many would experience all year. There would be ale, rough bread, perhaps some roasted fowl or a shared stew. Music would be provided by local fiddlers or pipers, and dancing would be boisterous and joyful. Peasant weddings underscored the vital role of community. The entire village often participated, celebrating the formation of a new household that would contribute to the collective well-being. It was a day of rare indulgence, a chance to set aside the constant toil and simply revel in shared joy and hope for the future. You might find yourself caught up in a lively circle dance, feeling the warmth of human connection and the simple, profound happiness of a community celebrating life and continuity. These were unions forged not by grand political designs, but by the fundamental human need for companionship, survival, and the enduring cycle of life on the land. You've just experienced the rustic charm and practical joy of a peasant wedding. Now, let's ascend the social ladder, leaving behind the humble cottages for the grand, draughty halls of power, and delve into noble weddings, power plays, and grandeur. Here, a marriage was far more than a union of two individuals. It was a strategic alliance, a political chess move with kingdoms and vast estates hanging in the balance. You might feel a chill wind whip through the open arches of a castle, sensing the immense stakes involved. The mainstream historical fact is that noble weddings were meticulously orchestrated affairs, designed to consolidate power, secure territory, and forge alliances. While a marriage might be celebrated with lavish feasts and impressive displays, its fundamental purpose was rarely personal affection. Instead, it was about diplomacy, economics, and warfare by other means. A marriage could end generations of feuding between rival families, bring vast new lands and revenues into a lord's domain, or secure critical military support in times of conflict. Imagine the detailed negotiations between family emissaries, poring over maps and ledgers, not wedding invitations. The selection of a noble spouse was almost entirely dictated by strategic considerations. A young lord or lady might be betrothed in infancy, their future dictated by the shifting political landscape. Factors such as the size of the dowry, the strategic location of lands, the military strength of the allied family, and the potential for a powerful lineage were paramount. Consanguinity, or blood relation, was a constant concern. As to close a tie could render a marriage invalid in the eyes of the church, potentially leading to devastating consequences for inheritance and legitimacy. You might see a weary family elder meticulously tracing ancestral lines on a scroll, trying to find a match that was both advantageous and canonically permissible. Here's a quirky tidbit to ensure the bride, particularly a very young one, would be fertile and capable of bearing heirs. There were sometimes rather unsettling customs or tests that, while not universally practiced, appear in some historical accounts. These were often more folklore than formal procedure, but they reflect the intense pressure for progeny in noble unions. For instance, legends persist of brides being subjected to scrutiny by experienced older women before the bedding ceremony to assess their readiness for childbearing. Historians still argue about the true prevalence and nature of such practices. Were they genuine premarital health checks or merely sensationalized? Anecdotes of a highly patriarchal society obsessed with lineage. You might find yourself feeling a profound sense of relief that your reproductive capabilities aren't subject to public examination. The wedding ceremonies themselves were often grand spectacles designed to impress and project power. Held in magnificent castle chapels or cathedrals, they involved elaborate rituals, richly dressed clergy, and a retinue of noble guests, all in their finest attire. The procession from the bride's home or a nearby manor to the church would be a magnificent parade of armed retainers, finely dressed ladies, and musicians. The feast, as we discussed, would be legendary in its scale, featuring exotic foods, professional entertainers, and copious amounts of fine wine and ale. Every detail, from the cut of the bride's gown to the number of courses at the feast, was a statement of status and wealth. The ultimate goal of a noble marriage was the production of legitimate heirs. Without them, an entire lineage could die out, and vast estates could fall into dispute or revert to the crown. This placed immense pressure on the young couple, particularly the bride, to be fruitful, the entire apparatus of a noble household. Its wealth and its political standing revolved around the successful continuation of the bloodline through a well-matched and fertile union. So, as you observe the lavish displays, the solemn faces, and the subtle political maneuvering, you understand that noble weddings were not just celebrations. They were cornerstones of power, the very fabric upon which medieval society was built, weaving together ambition, legacy, and survival. You've seen the sheer grandeur and political calculation behind noble weddings. Now, let's scale up even further to the very pinnacle of medieval society, where the stakes were nothing less than the fate of nations. Royal marriages, dynasties forged, wars avoided. Here, a wedding was arguably the most potent diplomatic tool available, a living treaty capable of uniting kingdoms or preventing devastating conflicts. You might feel the weight of history in the air, imagining the tension in a throne room as kings and queens negotiate the futures of their children, and by extension, their entire realms. The mainstream historical fact is that royal marriages were almost exclusively political alliances, meticulously negotiated to achieve specific geopolitical goals. Love, if it emerged, was a purely coincidental bonus. A princess might be married off to a rival king's son to cement a peace treaty after years of war, transforming enemies into reluctant in-laws. A prince might marry a foreign heiress to claim new territories or to secure a strategic port. These unions were decided by monarchs and their advisors, often with little to no input from the bride or groom, who were simply pawns in a much larger game of international relations. Imagine a young royal, perhaps barely a teenager, receiving news that their life's trajectory has been irrevocably altered by a diplomatic decree from their father. It's enough to make the pressures of a modern arranged blind date feel like a walk in the park. The negotiations for royal marriages could last for years, involving detailed discussions not just about dowry and dower, which would be immense, often including entire provinces or vast sums of gold, but also about succession rights, military aid, and even religious differences. Royal families frequently sought matches that would secure powerful military alliances, preventing invasions or providing crucial support in ongoing conflicts. A carefully chosen marriage could stabilize a fragile border, create a common front against a powerful enemy, or even unite two separate crowns under a single lineage. You'd see chroniclers meticulously recording every detail, knowing that the ink on the marriage contract held more weight than any formal declaration of war or peace. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some royal marriage contracts contained clauses specifying the number of children the couple was expected to produce, particularly male heirs, or even detailing what would happen if the bride proved barren. While not always legally enforceable, they reflected the immense pressure for fertility and dynastic continuity. Imagine the sheer awkwardness of a royal meeting where the fertility prospects of a teenage princess were being openly discussed by grizzled diplomats. Historians still argue about the psychological toll these pressures took on royal couples. Were they simply resigned to their fate, or did the weight of dynastic duty create immense personal strain, sometimes leading to rebellion or even desperation? You're left to wonder if any royal bride ever secretly hoped her intended was, shall we say, less than robust. The royal wedding ceremony itself was a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur, designed to project the power, wealth, and legitimacy. of the monarchies involved, held in magnificent cathedrals, adorned with tapestries and banners. They involved elaborate processions with thousands of participants, priceless garments, and immense feasts lasting for days. Diplomats from across Europe would attend, observing every detail, gauging the strength of the alliance, and assessing the future of the respective kingdoms. The entire event was a carefully choreographed display of political theatre, a powerful message sent to both domestic subjects and foreign rivals. Royal marriages, therefore, were rarely about the personal happiness of the individuals. They were crucial instruments of statecraft, defining borders, shaping economies, and forging the very destiny of nations. The lives of princes and princesses were sacrifices laid on the altar of national interest, their personal desires utterly secondary to the demands of the crown. So, as you see a young queen, perhaps still feeling like a child, being led down the aisle towards a complete stranger from a foreign land, you understand that this is not merely a wedding. It is a profound act of state, a living embodiment of diplomacy upon which the peace or war of an entire continent could depend. You've just witnessed the monumental stakes of royal marriages, where diplomacy trumped destiny. Now, let's lighten the mood slightly, or perhaps deepen the intrigue, by exploring some truly fascinating elements that peppered medieval wedding celebrations, unusual customs, quirkier than you'd guess. Beyond the banns and the feasts, medieval people had a penchant for traditions that range from the charmingly symbolic to the outright bizarre, reflecting a world steeped in folk belief and local variation. You might find yourself stifling a chuckle or raising an eyebrow at some of these bygone practices. The mainstream historical fact is that while core elements of medieval weddings were widespread, regional and local variations produced a rich tapestry of unique customs. These could arise from ancient pre-Christian practices, specific local superstitions, or simply distinctive community traditions that evolved over centuries. What was perfectly normal in one village might be unheard of in another, creating a delightful mosaic of marital rites across Europe. It highlights that medieval society, despite its apparent rigidity, was far from monolithic in its everyday expressions. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some parts of medieval England, it was customary for guests to literally scramble for the bride's garter or stocking after the bedding ceremony. Not quite the polite toss we see today. The men would rush into the chamber, and the bride's stockings would be thrown out, sometimes followed by a wild scramble to be the first to retrieve them. Finding one was considered a sign of good luck, particularly for finding your own spouse. Soon, imagine the scene. A room full of rowdy men, perhaps a bit tipsy from the feast, wrestling over a piece of silk, all while the newly married couple is trying to get some privacy. Historians still argue about the precise origins of this particular custom. Was it a fertility rite, a test of virility, or simply a boisterous tradition designed to add to the revelry? You're left to wonder if the bride always had a spare pair ready. Beyond the garter scramble, other oddities abounded. In some Germanic traditions, the bride might wear an elaborate, sometimes heavy, crown adorned with coins, which was not only a display of wealth, but also a form of wearable dowry or savings. Imagine trying to dance with that perched precariously on your head. In other areas, particularly in Scandinavia, the bride might wear a bridal crown passed down through generations, often quite elaborate and sometimes even believed to have protective or fertility-bestowing powers. Another peculiar custom involved the use of noisy distractions. You might recall the singing during the bedding ceremony, but some communities took it further, employing shivery raucous processions, with pots, pans, and loud instruments, designed to make as much noise as possible outside the couple's home on their wedding night. While sometimes used to mock unpopular marriages for legitimate weddings, it was believed to drive away evil spirits or to symbolically announce the consummation of the marriage. It was the medieval equivalent of setting off fireworks, but with considerably less precision and more clanging. Historians still debate the true intention behind chivalry at weddings. Was it always a form of benign celebration, or did it sometimes contain an element of social pressure or even playful torment for the newlyweds? You might find yourself reaching for earplugs, but secretly enjoying the chaotic energy. You might also encounter symbolic acts with animals. In some agricultural regions, a bride might be presented with a sow or a piglet, symbolizing fertility and prosperity. In others, symbolic ploughing of a small patch of earth might occur, linking the marriage to the fecundity of the land. These rituals highlight the deep connection between medieval people and the natural world, their lives intertwined with the cycles of planting and harvest. These unusual customs, whether humorous or deeply symbolic, offer a vibrant glimpse into the diverse cultural landscape of medieval Europe. They underscore that while the Church imposed broad doctrines, local communities often retained their own unique ways of celebrating, cementing bonds, and warding off misfortune. So, as you observe these strange yet captivating traditions, you realize that medieval weddings were a rich tapestry woven with threads of belief, practicality, and sometimes just a touch of delightful madness. You've delved into some truly quirky wedding customs, revealing the rich tapestry of medieval beliefs. Now, let's pivot from specific rituals to the broader underlying current that permeated almost every aspect of medieval life. And certainly, every significant event, like a wedding, superstitions, protecting the new couple. In a world where the line between the natural and supernatural was blurry, people relied heavily on folk beliefs and charms to ward off evil, ensure fertility, and secure good fortune for the newlyweds. You might find yourself noticing small, seemingly insignificant details, a specific herb, a particular gesture, all imbued with protective power. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval weddings were rife with superstitions, reflecting a deep-seated belief in the power of good and bad omens, spirits, and the need for magical protection. From the moment of betrothal to the first night in the marital bed, numerous rituals and objects were employed to ensure the couple's fertility, happiness, and safety from malevolent forces, whether earthly or otherworldly. These weren't just quaint folk tales. They were serious attempts to influence fate in a world that often felt unpredictable and dangerous. Imagine a nervous bride clutching a tiny, hidden amulet, hoping it will guarantee her a healthy firstborn son. One of the most common and enduring superstitions revolved around fertility. Throwing grain, wheat, or rice, for example, over the couple. As they left, the church was almost universal, symbolizing a wish for a bountiful harvest of children. Eggs were also often associated with fertility and might be consumed or featured in some way. The color green, strangely enough, was sometimes considered unlucky for brides in certain regions, perhaps due to its association with fairies or mischievous spirits, leading to its avoidance in wedding attire. So, while your modern wedding might have a color scheme chosen for aesthetics, theirs might be chosen to literally ward off unseen perils. Here's a quirky tidbit to ensure the bride's good luck and protect her from envious spirits. It was sometimes customary for the bride to wear something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. A rhyme that has remarkably persisted to this day, though its original medieval meanings are often lost. Something old represented continuity with the past and protection for the family line. Something new symbolized optimism for the future. Something borrowed came from a happily married friend or relative, passing on their good fortune. And something blue traditionally symbolized purity and fidelity. As blue was the color of the Virgin Mary, historians still argue about the precise origins and widespread nature of this exact rhyme. But the underlying concepts of protective and auspicious items were certainly prevalent. You're left to wonder how many medieval brides searched desperately for that something blue. In a world of limited dyeing options, another pervasive superstition involved warding off evil spirits or bad luck. Bells were often rung during the procession or at the church door, their sound believed to scare away malevolent entities. Iron, too, was seen as a protective element, and a small piece of iron might be sewn into the bride's dress or the groom's tunic. The wedding feast itself, with its abundance and revelry, was believed to overwhelm any negative influences, creating an atmosphere of overwhelming joy that no evil could penetrate. You might notice a small, rusty nail tucked into a bouquet, or hear the constant jingle of bells during the procession. All part of an invisible battle against the unseen dot. The timing of the wedding was also crucial. Certain days or seasons might be deemed unlucky, while others were highly favored. For instance, Lent was traditionally a period when marriages were discouraged or forbidden by the church, but folk belief also held it to be an inauspicious time. Predicting the weather on the wedding day was a common preoccupation, with sunshine seen as a good omen and rain as less so, though some traditions saw rain as a symbol of fertility. These superstitions often blended seamlessly with Christian beliefs, creating a syncretic worldview where God's will and magical protection coexisted. As you absorb these layers of belief, you recognize that medieval people were not passive recipients of fate. They actively sought to influence their destinies, especially in a momentous event like a wedding. Every small gesture, every worn charm, every whispered prayer was an attempt to invoke blessings and defend against the pervasive anxieties of an unpredictable world. It's a testament to the enduring human need for hope and control, even when faced with the grand uncertainties of life and love. You've traveled through the ages, witnessing the practical arrangements, grand spectacles, and deeply ingrained superstitions that defined medieval weddings. Now, as our journey nears its end, let's reflect on the legacy of medieval weddings, echoes in modernity. It might surprise you how many of the traditions we consider quintessentially wedding today actually have roots stretching back to this distant, often brutal, but endlessly fascinating period. You might find yourself seeing your own wedding photos, or those of friends, in a completely new light. The mainstream historical fact is that numerous modern wedding customs are direct, albeit often altered, descendants of medieval practices. Think about the simple act of exchanging rings. This tradition, symbolizing an unbreakable bond and the giving of a promise, comes directly from medieval betrothal and wedding rites. The idea of a formal ceremony in a church, presided over by a cleric, is a clear legacy of the church's increasing dominance over marriage as a sacrament from the 12th century onwards. Even the concept of a honeymoon, while not a specific medieval custom, finds a faint echo in the post-wedding period of feasting and celebration, where couples retreated to begin their new lives, often with a celebratory mead or honey wine, consumed for a month. Consider the notion of witnesses. While modern weddings might have a maid of honor and best man for symbolic reasons, their medieval counterparts were absolutely essential for legal validation, their presence serving as the living record of the union. The tradition of throwing rice or grain over the couple for fertility, a charming gesture today, is a direct continuation of ancient medieval superstitions aimed at ensuring a bountiful harvest of children. Even the wedding feast, transformed into modern receptions, carries the indelible mark of those lavish medieval banquets designed to display wealth and forge communal bonds. You might suddenly notice the uncanny resemblance between your friend's elaborate tiered cake and the medieval subtleties designed to impress. Here's a quirky tidbit. The very idea of a bridal party with bridesmaids and groomsmen has medieval roots. Originally, bridesmaids sometimes acted as decoys to confuse evil spirits, dressing similarly to the bride, while groomsmen were effectively the groom's loyal armed guard, there to prevent any abduction attempts on the bride, or perhaps even the groom himself, during a potentially contentious alliance. Imagine your groomsmen today having to actually fend off angry rivals with swords. Historians still argue about the precise point at which these protective roles evolved into purely ceremonial ones. Did the custom simply lose its practical function as society became safer, or did it always contain an element of symbolic protection, even in its earliest forms? You're left to wonder if your bridesmaids secretly carry hidden daggers, just in case. Even the engagement ring, especially with a diamond, has a historical lineage. While diamonds weren't commonly used until later, the practice of a betrothal ring as a symbol of commitment was firmly established in the Middle Ages. The concept of the dowry, though thankfully no longer a widespread practice, left its mark on concepts of prenuptial agreements and discussions around marital assets. The solemnity of the vows, though personalized today, still carries the echoes of those simple yet profound declarations made at the church door centuries ago. So, as you slowly emerge from this journey back in time, you realize that the medieval wedding, far from being an alien custom, is woven into the very fabric of our modern traditions. It serves as a powerful reminder that while societies evolve, and our reasons for marrying may shift from pragmatic survival to romantic love, many fundamental human needs remain constant: the desire for companionship, the hope for new beginnings, the importance of family, and the enduring power of ritual to mark life's most significant transitions. The faint sounds of medieval music begin to fade, replaced by the soft hum of your own quiet space. As the past gently merges with the present, the quiet hum of the night seems to deepen now, settling around you like a soft blanket. The grand halls, the bustling villages, the solemn vows, and the raucous feasts begin to recede, dissolving into the peaceful darkness. You can let go of the meticulous details of dowries and the stern gaze of medieval priests. The pressures of lineage and the anxieties of proving consummation are drifting away, like smoke from a long-extinguished hearth. Allow your mind to gently wander, no longer striving to grasp every historical nuance, but simply absorbing the echoes of a world long past. Feel the quiet contentment that comes from understanding how much has changed, and yet how much of the human heart's simple desires remains eternal. The long, winding journey through medieval weddings has come to its peaceful close. The stories are told, the history unveiled. There is only the quietude now, and the gentle whisper of sweet dreams beginning to form. Let the images soften, the sounds hush, and surrender to the embrace of a restful night. Sweet dreams.